Let's talk about this Dark Side of the Ring finale, final episode of season 2. Ends the way that the season began, with a very heavy subject, that being the final days of Owen Hart. May 23rd, 1999. I can remember where I was. I was at my friend's house. And this is back in the black box days of cable, scrambled cable. I'd go over to his house, and we'd watch a lot of the pay-per-views there. And we're watching this Over the Edge show. And there was a hardcore match. I think it was Al Snow. It might have been Al Snow and Bob Holly, if I remember. But we get to the part of the show where Owen Hart, the Blue Blazer, is going to challenge the Godfather for the Intercontinental Championship. And I can remember watching the show, and they played the video package, the preview the match. And instead of then cutting to the ring, they cut back to the match graphic. And you can hear Jim Ross in the background. And Jim Ross is obviously the greatest of all time at what he does. Jim Ross's legendary voice. The voice of wrestling, the voice of people's childhoods in the Attitude Era, and all, or if you're older, maybe back in the Crockett and the NWA days, Mid-South days. Been doing this a long time. Never heard Jim Ross stammering and stuttering over his words like I heard him stammering and stuttering over his words here, as he's throwing it to a video package from earlier in the day with Kevin Kelly and the Blue Blazer. And I remember him saying, and he's like, we got big problems out here. And I remember we heard that, and we kind of looked at each other and thought, well, that's strange. What does that mean? We didn't know what that meant. And they showed the Blue Blazer promo. They cut back, and they had a crowd shot. And then reality began to sink in. And he's on commentary talking about how this is not an angle. He goes, this is not a wrestling angle. This is not part of the entertainment here tonight. And he has this look on his face, and you could tell something is very wrong. And I will never forget just that feeling of sitting there and not knowing, because you don't know he fell. Okay, well, from how high did he fall? Was he being lowered and he fell from 20 feet? Did he fall from the roof? I mean, what exactly is going on here? And I vividly remember, as this was going on, and eventually they got Owen on the gurney and they wheeled him out. And I remember looking at my friend and going to him, man, can you imagine if he actually died? Basically like the shitstorm the company would be in. But I don't think in my mind I was actually thinking that he was going to die. I just remember thinking, man, can you imagine the trouble this company would be in? The headache they would have if this guy died on their pay-per-view? And didn't really think anything of it. I just thought, well, hopefully they'll give an update on his condition. Obviously he's hurt. How badly is he hurt? And we didn't find out until later in the show. And when it was after there was I think an 8-man tag or a 10-man tag with the Union. I remember that because I remember the Union music playing and Mankind was outside the ring and the commentators just laid out. It was very quiet. And then they cut back to the announcers and Jim Ross made the announcement. And I can remember sitting there just this feeling of just shock and awe. Like just, it overcomes you. Like you can't believe what you just heard. Like, excuse me, what was that? And we sat there in silence. We sat there in silence. And I can remember walking home because his house was within walking distance of mine. And he gave me the tape because I made sure we taped every pay-per-view. I still have it. Still have the VHS tape. I took the tape with me. Didn't know what I was going to do with it. I walked home. I walked in the door. I can hear the television on upstairs. And my brother, I think, was in the living room, and I could hear, because it was about 11 o'clock. So the 11 o'clock news had just come on as I walked in the door, and I can hear Channel 4. I could hear the NBC newscaster. It was the lead story in New York, so I'm sure it was like this across the country. And it was the lead story that night. Pro wrestler Owen Hart, died in a stunt in Kansas City, and I already knew that, but I just started bawling. It just sort of, at that moment, it just sort of hit me. Now, they didn't know. Even my mother was like, oh, I heard about what happened with Owen Hart. And I'm like, I don't even want to talk about this right now. It's awful. Never forget that feeling for the rest of my life. When I saw the episode list for season 2 of Dark Side, I knew exactly which episodes were going to be the hardest, I guess, to kind of get through. It was going to be the Chris Benoit episode and the Owen Hart episode. It does not get any worse than those two. The death of Owen Hart is the wrestling tragedy that I would say kind of haunts me. Like when I think about it, kind of haunts me the most. The Benoit tragedy is the worst ever in wrestling because 3 people lost their lives, including a 7-year-old boy. But the death of Owen Hart is the one that just kind of gets me the most when I think back on it. And maybe it's just because my memories are still so vivid from that night. And that's just kind of how I feel. Other people may disagree, but that's the one that's still, when you really go back in time and you kind of, again, you go back through what happened and why it happened, how it didn't have to happen. Everything about this it's awful. It's absolutely awful. I shared a picture on Twitter, 2 pictures, actually. The one from meeting Owen in '98 couldn't be nicer. But I still have the Velcro armband. I can't believe I still have this thing. I have the Velcro armband that I wore the day after he died. Me and some friends, we decided we're going to wear black armbands because that's what you do sometimes, I guess, when somebody passes away. And yeah, we were all wrestling fans, so had these little Velcro armbands with the initials OH written on the outer band in whiteout. After 21 years, I still have that damn armband here. It was a huge coup for the producers of this show to get Owen's wife and to get Owen's kids to be interviewed for this episode. It was an episode from their perspective. A lot of it was from their perspective. They did not have full creative control or anything like that over the episode, but they gave their side of the story. WWE obviously was not going to participate in this. They could have if they wanted to. I'm sure the producers would have loved to have gotten WWE's either a statement or some kind of perspective from them, but they have not participated in any of these shows, which you can understand. It doesn't exactly paint them in the best light. But Bret Hart was also not interviewed for this, which some people were surprised by. Well, you would think that Bret was so close to Owen and so close to the situation. Why would he not be interviewed? It wasn't because he wasn't asked to be interviewed. It was because he ignored them. When they reached out to him, he was non-responsive. Whatever his reasons were. He and Martha had a falling out years ago. They are not on good terms. Or at least from Bret's view, he does not like Martha. He's made that very clear. So maybe that had something to do with it. I will get into why they are estranged later. But this all came together with Martha. The producers didn't know what her reaction was going to be. She has largely stayed divorced from pro wrestling ever since her husband passed away. But they reached out to her. And she got back to them and said, listen, I have a list of 10 questions. I want you to answer these questions. I want to see what it is that you're going for here with this. If you can answer these questions, and I'm satisfied with the answers, I would be more than happy to participate. And when she got the answers from the producers, apparently she was blown away. She said they everything that she was hoping they would say, they said. And they flew to meet with her and with Oj, her son, and it just kind of went from there. You cannot properly tell Owen Hart's story without the family being involved. You just can't do it. And seeing all of that home movie footage that they gave us here of Owen Hart, the family man, Owen Hart at home, Owen Hart with his kids and out, just on these family outings and stuff. It was depressing to watch. It was cool to see, but it was depressing to watch him on camera talk about how, one day I hope to have enough money saved up to get out of the wrestling business and enjoy life with my family. It's not Martha telling this. This is Owen in his own words on video. Telling the viewer, little did he know that it would air on TV one day, but telling the viewer that this is what his goal was one day. He wanted to make his money, to make a good living and get the hell out so he can spend his days enjoying time with his wife and kids. And then you realize that this man was robbed of that. This whole family was robbed of that. He was robbed of that because of a stupid bullshit stunt that did not need to happen in the first place. Had Owen made a regular entrance that night, not a single person would have cared. Not a single person. Not one person would have cared that he didn't rappel from the ceiling. You could have done some kind of comedy entrance with him just coming down the aisle, like every other wrestler on the card that night. The one guy who didn't make a regular entrance that night is the one who died. It would not have changed the show one bit. It did not need to happen. I'm not going to say that I enjoyed this episode, because I don't think enjoyed is the right word for something like this. I think it's a good overview of what happened that day, but it left out a lot of details that they just did not have time to get into, and I'm going to flesh that out for you here. This episode really would have benefited from being a double episode like the Benoit one. You open the season with a double episode. Why not end with a double episode? Close the season with a double episode. And it's not just the details of the lawsuit and the settlement that were left out. They could have included more on Owen Hart, the Practical Joker, the lighter side of things. They did film stuff. They actually just released a 4-minute clip, kind of a deleted scene or an extra, that's up on on their YouTube channel, the Vice YouTube channel, talking about that, talking about Owen Hart, the ribs that he would pull on people. Not anything overly mean-spirited, like you hear stories about other guys that used to cut up people's clothes and destroy their property and stuff like that, although Harley Race did get his revenge on Owen for one of the more famous pranks that he pulled. I know I've told this story before, but for those who have never heard it, it is kind of a funny story. All the wrestlers, whenever they were in Kansas City, they would be invited to Harley's house for a big barbecue. And eerily enough, Kansas City. But anyway, as the story goes, Owen spiked Harley's chili. He was making chili for everybody, and he spiked the chili with hot sauce, like a lot of hot sauce. Like he overspiked it. And he waited, and then everybody, when they took the chili, they're dying. They are dying. Except Owen. Owen was the only one who wasn't dying. See, if he was smart, he would have acted like he was. But he was the only one who didn't act that way, and that's what gave it away, that obviously he was behind it. And so I guess the next night at Monday Night Raw, Harley comes up to Owen to shake his hand for a prank well done. And when Owen extends his hand out to shake Harley's hand, he didn't realize that Harley had a small taser in the palm of his hand. And he shocked Owen. And Owen fell to the ground. Now, there's some dispute about whether he actually lost consciousness or not. That must have been a hell of a shock. But he went down. The lesson here is never mess with Harley Race's chili. Owen found that out the hard way. But just silly stuff. Most of the time it was just kind of silly stuff. They didn't have time for it here, obviously, but it would have been nice, to add that. Maybe that's better for a more complete Owen Hart documentary. But that would have been nice. But just to kind of talk about Owen's career first, obviously he was the Blue Blazer, not just in 99 and the end of 98, but he was the Blue Blazer in WWF when he came in 88, 89. He played that role for a few years. Then it was the Rocket, right? The Rocket, Owen Hart. Actually, before that, you had the New Foundation. It was him and Jim Neidhart. That was never going to work. It's like New Coke, right? It's just not going to work. The sequel, come on, the sequel. When is the sequel as good as the original? Outside of maybe, I don't know, The Godfather, and you can find examples of that. Very rarely is the sequel or the copy as good as the original. High energy, him and Coco Beware. I've been watching old Superstars lately that they have on the network from 92. Oh my God. It just, they obviously wanted Owen to show more of his personality, but this was terrible. It was terrible. And the big baggy pants and everything, it's no wonder it didn't work. The feud with Brett, that was kind of the highlight of his career. Sibling rivalry, the whole story that fed into their WrestleMania 10 match. Owen becomes the King of Hearts, wins the King of the Ring. Their cage match at SummerSlam, the greatest cage match. I'm not talking Hell in a Cell, but the greatest cage match, steel cage match in WWF history is Brett and Owen at SummerSlam 94. I could sit down and watch that match anytime. And it's over 30 minutes long. It's not a short match. Doesn't matter. I can sit down and watch that match anytime. Not an ounce of blood was spilled in that cage, and they went in there and had this incredible match. An incredible post-match, too, with all the family at ringside and all the brawling and everything. So that whole period from 94 in many ways was kind of the pinnacle, the peak of Owens' career. Teaming with the British Bulldog, the Hart Foundation faction, the match with Steve Austin, which unfortunately lives on for other infamous reasons. The Montreal Screwjob, trying to leave the company. He was the one guy they would not let leave. The Bulldog bought himself out of... The Bulldog, I believe, spent $250,000 of his own money to buy himself an early release out of his contract so he can go to WCW. Owen was the guy, and Anvil left too, but Owen was the guy they were not going to let go of. Gave him more money, kept him under contract, had a match with Shawn Michaels on television that I still to this day do not understand for the life of me. Why they didn't save that match for the Royal Rumble in 98. Instead of doing a third pay-per-view match with Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, which is where Shawn hurt his back. And he ended up out of wrestling for 4 years. It's amazing how just the slightest little tweaks in the history timeline here could have changed things so dramatically. You know, maybe Shawn would have stuck around for the Attitude Era had he not been hurt, and he was still able to actually compete. I mean, he had other issues going on anyway, so he may have wound up in a bad spot no matter what. But I always think back to that, and I say, they had Owen attack him, and God, I mean, coming off the whole Montreal thing, and I remember Owen confronting Vince McMahon in the ring and grabbing him, I think, by the collar, and I'm like, boy, I wouldn't put the title on Owen because Austin was the chosen one. He was going to be crowned at WrestleMania, but why blow that match off on television and then build to something with Owen and Hunter? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. It really doesn't. It's one of the more bizarre decisions. Only thing I could think of is they just really wanted that visual at the end of the Royal Rumble of Kane setting the casket on fire, because you could have gone another way with it and had Owen and Shawn, and probably would have had a great match too, at the Rumble in 98, gotten a little more mileage out of it. You could have put Undertaker in the Royal Rumble match. You wanted to do something with him and Kane, just put him in the Rumble. Undertaker has now lost 2 matches to Shawn Michaels, Ground Zero. Or at least he didn't win. But he lost Hell in a Cell. They've already had 2 pay-per-view matches. They don't need to do a casket match. You can't top that Hell in a Cell. Undertaker wants to challenge for the championship and get his revenge on Shawn Michaels. What's the best way to do it? Win the Royal Rumble. I mean, I'm getting into the fantasy booking here, but anyway. There was a little period there where Owen was all of a sudden really hot, and then they cooled him down. They cooled him down right away. But then people will say, well, Owen should have been the champion. Owen Hart is one of the greatest uncrowned WWF champions of all time. Do I think that Owen could have had a run with the championship? I do. But 94. That was his best chance to get a run with that title, was in 94. I would not have made him the world champion. If it were me in 98, 99, 2000, it wouldn't have happened. Owen Hart was not, the guys they were pushing at that time, he was not above those guys. In terms of like popularity and hot acts to have, that was not the time to put the title on Owen Hart. If you were ever going to put the title on Owen Hart, you do it in 94. You have him win the championship sometime between, that after WrestleMania, but in that period before SummerSlam, and then have him drop it back to Brett at SummerSlam. Give him a little run, even if it's only a couple of months with the belt. Outside of that, I mean, I love Owen Hart, but not WWE champion. I think that's people just romanticizing a little too much. But again, this is all fantasy booking stuff. He joined the Nation. He started tagging with Jeff Jarrett. He was actually probably more of a tag team wrestler than anything else, if you think about it, between teaming with the Anvil, teaming with Coco Beware. He teamed with Brett for a little bit, but not too long. Teamed with Yokozuna. Teamed with the British Bulldog. Teamed with Jeff Jarrett. It's a big tag team, like a tag team specialist was Owen Hart. But I do agree with one thing that Chris Jericho said during this episode. Chris Jericho said, man, think of all of the guys, all of the talent that came into WWE. Had Owen lived in late 99 into 2000, Brock Lesnar came a little bit later. He came 2002, but Brock Lesnar, Kurt Angle, Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero. All of these names that came in that Owen could have worked with. He said Owen would have had a career resurgence. He did have one match with Kurt Angle. They did wrestle once. It was a dark match. They had a dark match before Raw 2 weeks before Owen died. I've never seen video, but there's been photographs. So I know they had a match. Kurt Angle was actually one of Owen Hart's final opponents. The last match Owen Hart ever had was it was a tag team match against Edge and Christian. There you go, 2 more names. Owen Hart and Edge, they could have had a program down the road at some point. It's not far-fetched at all to think that working with those guys could have extended Owen's career for another, who knows, another 5 years. Unless he wanted out. So Jim Ross, Jim Cornette, Jimmy Corderas, Godfather, D'Lo Brown, all interviewed for this episode. They were all there that night in Kansas City when Owen died. Owen was scheduled to win the Intercontinental title from the Godfather. Jimmy Corderas was in the ring. He was the referee for their match, or was going to be. Jim Ross was on the call that night with Jerry Lawler. Jim Ross is interviewed for this as well. Martha was interviewed. Her son, Oj, who was 7 years old at the time that his father died. Owen's daughter, Athena, who was only 3. She has very few memories of her father, which is very sad, because she was just too young to remember. She's got a few, but when you're 3, I mean, really, what are you going to remember when you're 3? Oj, at least, he was old enough. He has a lot of memories, a lot of fond memories with his dad. Oj now is a law school grad. He's practicing or plans to practice human rights law. Athena is studying. She's studying to be a journalist. I'm looking at these kids. I'm like, boy, do they look like Owen Hart's kids. You could tell. These are Owen Hart's kids. They look a lot like their father. John Pollock of Post Wrestling. He put out a great audio documentary that I shouted out last year. I'll shout it out again now because it's very well put together. Very well done. I haven't listened to it since it originally aired, but it had a lot of good stuff in there. And one of the people that he interviewed in the piece was a man named Trey Lindstrom. Trey Lindstrom was a wrestling fan who, some of the other wrestlers knew. He was one of these autograph seekers. So when wrestlers would come into town, when they would get into the airport, he would be there. He would want autographs. He'd probably be willing to drive these guys around and do favors for them. He was an autograph seeker. And when Owen got into Kansas City, he spotted Lindstrom. I don't think they made any kind of plans. He just happened to see him. I guess he was a regular in the city whenever the wrestlers would come in. Owen gets into the airport. He sees Lindstrom. He goes over to Lindstrom and he says, "Hey, I'm ready whenever you are." And Lindstrom is like, "Oh, okay." And so Lindstrom gave him a lift, right? I mean, it beats having to pay for a rental car, I guess. So Lindstrom gives him a lift to the hotel so he can check in. And then he gives him a lift to the arena, where I guess he must have been Owen's guest because he obviously was backstage with him. So I think they're eating lunch together. And this part of the story is what Martha, I think, tells in her book. But they're having lunch together. It's about 6 hours or so before the show. And over walks this guy, Bobby Talbert. Bobby Talbert, Martha mentioned him on the Vice special. He was the guy who WWE brought in to rig Owen up that night for the stunt. He was not their usual rig person. This was somebody different. He talked about, I was the one who overseed the same stunt with Sting in WCW a bunch of times, which isn't true. He was only an assistant to the person who actually did the rigging of Sting in WCW. And that was only on 3 occasions. So, sounds to me like Mr. Talbert embellished exactly what he did for Sting in WCW. He was not, quote, Sting's guy. But he wanted to rehearse the stunt. He wanted to rehearse the stunt with Owen, and Owen told him, "I've done it before, it's fine. It's fine." Owen hated heights. He did not want to have to go up there more than he had to, right? So if he already knew, oh shit, I got to go up there tonight, I don't want to go through the rehearsal and go up there again. If you're afraid of heights, I mean, my God, I'm afraid of heights too. I'll do things. I'll go on roller coasters and stuff like that, and you get that feeling of dread. You get that feeling like your palms start to get sweaty, you get all nervous. Like, I know that feeling. So I can totally understand that. Don't make me go up there and do this more than I have to. I've done it before. It'll be fine. So he told Trey, let's get out of here. He looked over at Trey and said, get me out of here. Get me out of here. He said, look, if I'm not around, Vince or Shane, they can't find me. And if they can't find me, then we can't do the stunt. Maybe they'll just ixnay the whole thing. So he left the arena basically to avoid having to do a rehearsal, with the idea that if they can't find me, they'll just have to drop the whole thing. As Lindstrom tells it, they're walking out of Starbucks, and Owen gets a phone call. And it's Vince McMahon. And when the call is over, Owen comes over, he says, well, Vince told me either I'm at Kemper Arena in 15 minutes, or I'm out of a job. And I no longer work for the WWF. That was the ultimatum that Owen was given by Vince McMahon. And at that point, he felt he had no choice. He didn't want to lose his job. So he took Owen back to the arena. And Owen had to go through a rehearsal. That was the last time he saw him when he drove him back to the arena and dropped him off. There was a rehearsal. I don't know if they used the same quick release mechanism, the shackle, or the old locking carabiner that was traditionally used. It would make sense that they used the quick release shackle, because otherwise, why the hell are you doing a rehearsal? You're either rehearsing with the equipment that you're going to use, or you're not rehearsing. It doesn't make any sense to rehearse with anything other than what they used that night. But I don't know that that's ever been confirmed whether or not they used the shackle or not. When Lindstrom showed up, he says, to attend the tribute show the next night to Owen at Monday Night Raw, he said Shane and Stephanie came over to him. And they said, we understand that you've got Owen's suitcase. You've got Owen's suitcase with his parking pass and all of his belongings. And Lindstrom said, yeah, I have his stuff. And Shane goes, well, you're going to have to hand that over to us. And we're going to have to ask you to leave the building. And he says, wait, you're telling me I can't even, I can't stay for the show? And he says Shane told him, tonight, we don't want you in the building. And that was that. He handed over Owen's belongings, and off he went. And one of the other shocking things that wasn't mentioned on the Vice special is that the original plan was for Owen to be lowered from the ceiling with Max Mini on his back. That was the original plan. That was at one point written into the show. He would be like the Blazers mascot. This is when WWE had some of the Mexican minis in for the shows. Max Mini got a little bit of a push, no pun intended, little push for Max Mini at the time. Late in the day, for whatever reason, they decided to scrap the idea. They scrapped the whole idea of having Max on Owen's back. But you think about this. That means that we came close to having potentially 3 people die in the ring that day. Jimmy Corderas, the referee, he was in the corner. Which is where Owen fell, the spot where Owen fell. He was clearing debris. There was a hardcore match right before. On the Vice special, Jim Cornette, he lost it. When he talked about Owen falling and supposedly yelling down below, he sees the referee and he's yelling down below, watch out. That's not something you see very often, is Jim Cornette cry, but he got emotional, he cracked here on this special. And he's talking about this guy's falling 80 feet to what he has to know is going to be his death. And his last words were, watch out, or look out, or whatever they may have been. Corderas cannot confirm that that's exactly what he said or that's what happened. People in the building, I guess they heard Owen screaming, but what exactly he was screaming or shouting, nobody can confirm. Jimmy didn't hear him say those words. He was paying attention to the corner, had no idea that Owen was in the middle of falling. But he didn't move out of the way because of that. He's just very lucky that Owen missed him when he landed, or else he would have been killed too. It's not a matter of, he would have cushioned the fall. No, you would have had 2 dead people instead of 1, had he landed on Corderas. Jerry Lawler told Corderas later on, he says, he saw Owen fall that last 15 or 20 feet. And all he was thinking was, oh my God, he's going to land on Jimmy. That's all Lawler was thinking. Oh my God, he's going to land on Jimmy. So now you throw Max Mini in there. We almost had potentially 3 deaths in one night, all for a stunt that did not need to happen. It's hard to believe that this could have been worse, but it easily could have been. Owen Hart fell 78 feet to his death. I cannot imagine what was going through his mind when that shackle released and he started falling. It scares me to death just thinking about it. And again, it became obvious that something was wrong when you hear Jim Ross stammering, we need help out here, and then they show the crowd. So at that point, you kind of knew. Although there's still that feeling of, is this a work? Is this part of the show? Once Jim Ross said, this is not part of the show, this is not a wrestling angle, it got real. And still, you'll have some people probably at that point who didn't believe it. But at that point, I knew, oh shit, something's wrong. Jim Ross said that Lawler's face was ashen when he came back to the announcement because Lawler got up right away to go see what was going on. When Lawler finally came back over, he said he looked white as a ghost. He looked like somebody who had just seen death. And the reason is, he did. He did see death. Jerry Lawler knew that Owen Hart was a goner. So after they carried him from the ring, the show went on. Martha says that he had broken some of the boards beneath the ring when he fell. There was a dip in that part of the ring. They were telling wrestlers, I guess, to stay away from that part of the ring. But the show went on. They had 3 more matches before Jim Ross told us that Owen Hart had died. And then they had 2 more after that. They never told the live audience in attendance, only the viewers at home. And they played, here on this special, they played the video of Jim Ross's announcement, which is just awful. JR said that Kevin Dunn was in his ear. And Kevin Dunn thought that somebody had alerted Jim Ross as to the latest update about Owen. Well, in fact, nobody did. Because they were about to go live again, put the camera on the announcers, and Jim Ross just says to Kevin, I don't have the update. Like, you got to tell me. You guys got to clue me in. I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what the update is. And he says that Dunn told him, hey, JR, Owen's dead. And we're back live in 10, 9, 8, counting the guy down. Now, I understand it's live television. There's a lot going on. Everybody's in a panic. But what a callous fucking thing to do to somebody. Just the fact that happened. I'm not saying Kevin Dunn was trying to be a prick, but what a callous fucking thing. What a horrible position to put this guy in. But he held it together. And again, that's why he's a pro. JR was a pro that night. I don't know how he kept it together. I really don't. He and Lawler barely kept it together the next night on television. Towards the end, when they got to that segment where Austin came out to give Owen one final toast, you could hear it in his voice. Jim Ross, he's devastated. None of those people should have been working. Absolutely devastated. I've come around over the years to the idea that the show should not have been stopped. I could see it from both sides, but looking back on it now all these years later, I can't believe the show went on. The show should have been stopped. I understand that you're forced to make a snap last minute quick decision under the worst of circumstances. There's a 50% chance you're making the right call, and there's a 50% chance that you're making the wrong call. That show should have been stopped. A man died in the ring. That ring is now a crime scene. I have no idea why the Kansas City Police Department did not immediately force them, once they found out about what happened, why they did not force them to stop the show and tarp off that whole area, just tarp it off as an active crime scene. The cops don't know, at that point, they don't know. Was it a homicide? Was it a suicide? Was he pushed? Was it an accident? That's why you have to investigate. How is that show even allowed to continue? As they cleaned the ring of potential evidence. They cleaned the ring. They sent other wrestlers to work in that very spot, in that very place. That a man just fell to his death, it is baffling to me that it was not stopped for that reason alone. And to send his co-workers, right, a lot of whom were the man's friends, out to perform when they clearly were not in the right emotional state to perform. To the point that a lot of them, like Jeff Jarrett and Deborah and Triple H and Chyna, when they came out, they had tears in their eyes. They were barely holding it together. All to get those final few matches in. It is ridiculous. Owens' cause of death, and they didn't get into all this in the episode. Owens' cause of death was blunt chest trauma. He severed his aorta upon impact, and the left side of his chest basically filled up with blood. Per the autopsy report, no skull fractures or injuries to the brain, the neck, the spinal column. He had a 4-inch laceration that cut through to the bone and basically disfigured his left elbow. They showed police photos during the episode taken after the show. Once they cleared the building out, they showed police, basically crime scene photos. And they had this one shot. You talk about haunting. They went up on the catwalk where Owen fell. And they aimed the camera down at the ring and they took a picture. So you got to see what it looked like from 80 feet up. You got to see what Owen was seeing when he fell. Now, I do want to clarify one thing. I don't think they misled on purpose, but something here is a little bit misleading. They showed one of the crime scene police photos was of a bloody canvas. As they're talking about Owen falling and everything, they're showing you this huge blood stain on the mat in the corner of the ring. Most of that blood was not from Owen. Most of that blood was from a bloodbath from the Brood that they had given to the Hardy Boys on Sunday Night Heat earlier before the pay-per-view. They took a bloodbath outside the ring, and if you go back and watch, you can see Matt, when he comes up from the bloodbath, he kind of leans on the ring apron. But in Martha's book, she does say that there was a blood sample taken from Owen from the ring. I guess some blood had pooled next to what the police later found to be fake blood, which was probably from the Brood segment. So that's where a lot of that blood was from. It was probably the fake blood. Some of it may have been Owens also that was in the ring, but people look at that and they think, my God, this guy was laying in this gigantic pool or puddle of blood. And I just thought that was a little, maybe not intentionally, but a little misleading. So that night, the attending doctor at the hospital told Martha, when he had a call to give her the bad news. And he was, are you alone? Are you sitting down? She's like, just tell me, if he's injured, he can recover from whatever the injury is. Just tell me. And then she found out that he's dead. And she completely lost it. But the doctor told her, I have Harley Race here. Harley Race is here. He accompanied your husband to the hospital. Would you like to speak with him? And she just told him, no, I don't even know him. And she hung up. Let me talk about, real quickly, Vince Russo. His name was not mentioned in this episode. Vince Russo was not interviewed for this, or if he was, they ended up not using the footage. We know they interviewed him for the Montreal Screwjob episode last season. They interviewed him for the Brawl for All episode this season. Not this one. For his part, Russo was the head writer at the time. For his part, Russo claims and has claimed to this day that the show was already booked and the show was already written without the stunt when he got a phone call the Thursday before the pay-per-view from a guy named Steve Taylor. Steve Taylor at the time was the director of operations for the WWF. He claims that Taylor called him. Okay, this Steve Taylor guy called him and said, hey, the guys who repel Sting in WCW, they're coming to Kansas City, which is where the pay-per-view was that weekend. He says, and they want to know if there's anything they can do on the show that night to kind of show us what they can do. Because they want to work with us. They want to work with the WWF. And Russo, he goes, oh, let me look through the card and see. He's looking through the card and he says, well, why don't we do something with the Blue Blazer? And Taylor said, that's great. That sounds good. So that was his idea. But he insists it wasn't something that was originally written into the show. He got the call, until he got the call from Taylor, and then he had to go kind of find a place on the card for them to do some kind of stunt. I don't think it's fair to put all of this on Vince Russo. I know Roddy Piper blamed Russo. There was that disgusting segment in the early days of TNA, right? The NWA TNA days, where they did this shoot or work shoot or whatever the hell it was, where Piper was there promoting his book, and he says, hey, Vince Russo, who was like the big heel authority figure at the time on TV, what do you think? But you killed my cousin. You killed Owen Hart. Then Vince Russo came out, and I have seen that. I've gone back and watched that occasionally on YouTube. It's a disgusting segment. It had no business being on television. Even if that's how Piper felt, that was not the right forum for it. It was almost like they were turning it into an angle. It was disgusting. It was shameful. But I'm sure Piper felt very, deeply about that, because he was a cousin to the family, and he considered Owen to be family. Owen was family. And maybe he really did hold Russo responsible for that. I'm just saying that wasn't the forum to turn this into what a lot of people thought, this is just, they're playing off the death of this guy. They're turning it into a fucking angle. But I remember that, and I know Piper held him accountable. Other people, Vince Russo killed Owen Hart. Look, I think it's unfair. It's unfair to make a comment like that. That's a heavy comment. And I think that's unfair. I think, I'm not going to bash the guy. That's all I have to say about Russo with respect to this. I'm not going to bash the guy. Martha told Vince McMahon she did not want them to show any of the funeral footage on television, which they did anyway. And there's no good defense for that. There is no good defense. You could say, well, we got Martha's side of the story here, and, it's not always that cut and dry. It's not fair to beat up on the WWF. Well, you know what? I'm going to beat up on them over that. The woman said, I don't want you to show funeral footage on television. She invited them to come. She had no problem with Vince McMahon and the WWF folks coming to the funeral. She invited them to the funeral. It's not like she kept them away. But she said, I don't want that aired on television, and they aired it anyway. There is no good defense for that. They went against her wishes on that. It was a private event. So I understand her being upset about that. Which brings us to the lawsuit. And what the hell happened? How does something like this, what happened to Owen, how does something like this happen? Martha brought a wrongful death suit against WWE, against the city of Kansas City, who owned Kemper Arena, and against Lumar. Lumar is the manufacturer of the snap shackle that Owen, or was used for Owen, in the stunt. So they were all listed as defendants, co-defendants in this suit. City of Kansas City, eventually they fell off. I mean, that probably would have been a tough sell anyway. There were depositions. There was testimony under oath, interviews with police. So that's where, much of this information I'm getting into here comes from. And by the way, Martha talks about how WWE sued her. They sued her back to try to get the case moved from Missouri to Connecticut, where I guess she couldn't be awarded punitive damages. I know that sounds really sinister and really sick. Oh my God, they turned around and sued the widow. But I'm sure that was Vince's legal team doing what legal teams are supposed to do in that situation. It's a shitty thing to do to somebody who just lost her husband, but that sounds to me less like what an evil SOB and more like legal strategy that probably any lawyer in the world in that situation would have recommended that they do. Joe Branham is a name that was mentioned in the Vice special by Martha. Joe Branham is the man that had rigged up Owen before, and multiple times they asked him to use the quick release method. WWE, Vince McMahon. This came right from Vince McMahon. Want Owen to use the quick release shackle because it looks better on television. There's got to be a quicker way for him to get out of that harness and everything and just do it in a quicker fashion. Multiple times he testified. They asked him to do it this way, and every single time he said no. He refused because he did not think it was the safe way to do it. And they also didn't want to pay the fee that he was asking. They were going to use him for a stunt on the May 10th, 1999 episode of Raw. That's 2 weeks before Owen died. That was the same night Owen had the dark match with Kurt Angle that I mentioned a little bit earlier on, before the show. But WWE said that, hey, the $5,000 that he's charging, it's over budget. It's too much. So he thought about it a little bit more. And he says, he testified that he told his assistant, listen, go back to them. tell them I'll do it for $2,000, because he got worried. He said, look, they're going to do this with somebody else who doesn't know what the hell they're doing. So just go ahead and tell them I'll drop my fee from $5,000 to $2,000. Because he was really worried. They're going to get some local person who's going to use that quick release, and he did not think it was the safe way to go. You know, this cannot be stressed enough. He did not think it was safe to use. They ended up canceling the stunt anyway, and they told him, well, we'll use you next time. Of course, they didn't use him next time. In Martha's book, she says Branham was alarmed that at least 3 different times Steve Taylor, there's that name again, Steve Taylor from the WWF, told him that Vince McMahon personally wanted Branham to use a quick release because it would look better on TV. Now, the harness that Owen was in for the stunt was used typically for dragging a person, you know, in some, maybe like a television or a movie stunt. It was used for dragging somebody behind a car. The clip was designed for the use of sailboats. It was meant to release on load. Last I checked, Owen Hart was not a sailboat. Now, as she tells the story, Martha wanted the case to go to trial. She wasn't interested in a settlement. She wanted justice. She wanted very publicly, she wanted this to go to trial. As a strategy, her lawyer said to her, look, you got to put an offer on the table. They don't have to accept it, but you got to put an offer on the table. Come up with a settlement number that we can put on the table. The only reason she says that she agreed to do that was to prevent WWE from constantly delaying the case. I guess legally you got to put a number down, then the clock starts. WWE would have 60 days to accept that number. If they didn't, that number would start accruing interest. She never thought they would accept the number. Until one day, she's thinking about it, and she starts to freak out. And she calls her lawyer. She says, well, what if they do? What if they accept the number, and then that's it? They accept the number, they pay it, and they're done with it. And now I can't take them to court. Now I can't take them to trial. And her lawyer smartened her up at that point and said, listen, Martha, at the end of the day, no matter how this ends, this is only going to be about money. Nobody is going to jail over this. I don't know what you're expecting out of this. Nobody is going to be locked up and incarcerated. It's going to come down to money. It's going to come down to some kind of settlement. And that's when she made the decision, she says, to start the Owen Hart Foundation, which she did, in fact, like a month or 2 after the verdict, I think, is when the Owen Hart Foundation was founded. She took her share of the money and she started this Owen Hart Foundation. You know, she had vengeance on her mind for WWE. You can understand why. She blamed them for the death of her husband and the father of her children. She's a single parent now in her mind because of the negligence of this company. So effectively what happened here is it was tactical. She agreed to settle. She agreed to drop Lumar, the manufacturer, from the case, accepting no money from them. So when I say she settled with them and whatever, she didn't settle for money. She agreed to release them from any responsibility whatsoever. What this did was it put the blame squarely on WWE. Her lawyer at the time said that Martha believed Lumar was not at fault, not even 1%. That was the lawyer's quote. Martha does not believe Lumar is responsible for this, not even 1%. Even though they were one of the original co-defendants when she first filed her suit. She had a change of heart. No pun intended. She had a change of heart. Later on, the problem is, a judge found that there was evidence suggesting that Martha's lawyers, if not Martha and the family itself, were, quote, motivated by a desire to prevent facts concerning Lumar's liability for this accident from coming to light in an effort to construct a punitive damages claim against WWE. And the core of this is important because you can tell that Martha really wanted to stick it good to WWE because she held them responsible for what happened here. WWE pitched a fit over this. They said, this is illegal, what's going on here. This is not right. By state law in Missouri, which is where this accident took place, one defendant in a case seeking reimbursement from a co-defendant, which is what Lumar was, would not be allowed. They would not be allowed to do that. So in other words, by reaching an agreement with Lumar to drop them and go after WWE only, WWE by law would not be able to then turn around and sue Lumar for reimbursement. If they had to, let's say, pay out a large settlement to the family, they would not then be allowed to turn around and say, okay, well, here you go, here's your money, but now we're going to go sue the manufacturer and we're going to get that money back. By state law, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. And they raised the stink. And the judge agreed with them. The judge sided with WWE. That something seems a little rotten about this whole arrangement. That's why I believe her. Some people are going to go, of course, yeah, she says it wasn't about the money. You know what? I believe her. And I'll tell you why I believe her. I believe her when she says that she wasn't motivated by money because Lumar had $50 million in insurance coverage. If it was just about the money, she could have sued them and made off like a bandit with more than the $18 million that she got from WWE. I mean, Lumar is not exactly some mom and pop shop. Look them up. They're a big company. So why not sue them if it was only about the money? They're the manufacturer, $50 million insurance policy. Why not sue them? The actual breakdown of the settlement was $10 million for Martha, $3 million for each of her kids, and $1 million apiece for Stu and Helen, each of Owen's parents. That's how it was broken down according to a story in the Kansas City Star that I found from November of 2000. That I did not know. I did not know that's how it broke down, so there you go. I can absolutely believe that it was not her primary motivation here. If it was, again, she didn't have very good lawyers. If money was her primary motivation, then she was failed by her lawyers. So what do you think WWE ended up doing? They went after Lumar, and Lumar settled. And much of what WWE paid to the family was covered by insurance anyway. I think WWE may have actually made a profit off of this case. I think they may have made a profit off of this. For Martha, it was less an issue of faulty equipment and more an issue of negligence. The equipment did what the equipment was designed to do. What it was not designed to do was suspend a human being 80 feet in the air. They had no business rigging her husband up with this equipment in the first place. Lumar didn't put Owen up on that catwalk. WWE did. It was their idea. And they chose to cheap out and go with somebody who had no business overseeing a stunt like this. Using equipment that never should have been used, that their own rigger said, you should not be using this equipment, it's not safe. That's where the negligence comes from. And WWE was absolutely negligent in this case. Tom Buchanan worked as a WWE photographer for many, many years. You may remember that name if any of you, like me, used to buy the old WWF magazines back in the day. His name was captioned underneath a lot of those photos. He was there that night. He was standing 20 feet away from where Owen landed. He said, I wouldn't have hung a tiny light fixture with a single snap shackle like the one that they used for Owen Hart, let alone a 230-pound human being. And then you got the family aspect, which is the other shameful part about this. With the family, it got very nasty. That's the other real shame here. Those kids don't just lose their father. They lost a good chunk of their family when they all became estranged from one another. And to this day, she and her kids, they have no relationship to the rest of the family. That includes Brett. Brett and Owen's sister, Ellie, who married Jim Neidhart, the mother of Natalia. Ellie is the sister that Martha had mentioned, who took some of Martha's legal documents that happened to be laying around Stu and Helen's house one day. She came across these documents, and maybe there was something in there that alarmed her. Maybe she felt she had good reason to do it, but she faxed Martha's legal documents over to the other team. She faxed them to Jerry McDevitt and WWE lawyers. Martha says Brett was very helpful to her early on. When she filed suit against WWE, Brett wanted her to also help him get the rights back to all of his wrestling footage. He was still on the outs at the time with Vince McMahon after what happened in Montreal. His legacy is the most important thing. You listen to Brett talk, you could tell he takes this very seriously. His legacy is so important to him. His legacy in the wrestling business is so important to him. I remember Brett telling the story at the Hall of Fame when he was inducted. He says, the one thing, I knew that night when they screwed me in Montreal, I knew one day I would be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And I'm thinking to myself, you're so full of shit. You're so full of shit. You think Bret Hart was thinking about the Hall of Fame the night of Montreal? Give me a break. But I do believe that his legacy is clearly very important to him. That much I know. That much is obvious. And he saw an opportunity here to try to get his footage, which, by the way, is not his footage. Let's be clear. It's not Bret Hart's footage. It's WWE's footage. I can understand him being very protective of his legacy. It's why he came back in 2005 to do his DVD. He got wind of a DVD they were working on about him, a hit piece called Screwed. Remember that whole fiasco? It was going to be done in the same, the way the Rise and Fall of the Ultimate Warrior hit piece was done. He didn't want that, so he quickly made up with Vince McMahon so the DVD would get scrapped, which it was. And in its place, he got himself a 3-disc DVD set with matches that he was allowed to come into the studio and curate for himself. Bret has always taken his legacy very seriously. He's always taken himself very seriously. But this just sounds tacky as all hell. And she claims when Bret did not get his footage, when things were obviously not going well, and with the suit and everything else going on, and he didn't get his footage, he yelled at her to the point that she was crying. And that was the beginning of the rift between Martha and Bret. Now, it's worth noting, you might say, well, that's Martha's side of the story. And it is. That's the story as she tells it. But it is worth noting that when this came out this week, and she's been making the rounds to help promote the special, doing interviews, Bret did put a statement out. And he doesn't exactly deny the idea that he wanted the footage to be part of it, or he was upset because he didn't get his footage. All he said the other day was this. He said, while I am not interested in engaging in any more media mudslinging between Martha and myself, especially in light of a global pandemic, I will say that our fallout is multifaceted. To say that it only involved being able to access and use my WWE footage and photos for future projects would merely be an oversimplification and inaccurate. I will not comment any further on this matter. I am the biggest Bret Hart fan that you'll find. You guys know that. I'm a big fan of Bret Hart the wrestler. But him bringing his footage into this, making this a priority when all of this was going down, this did not seem to be the time nor the place. And I know Bret Hart is also pissed at Martha for standing in the way of Owen being inducted into the Hall of Fame. This was his little brother, They worked together, and I'm sure Bret would love to give a speech in front of all these people one day about Owen at the Hall of Fame. I will say this about the Hall of Fame. Martha and her son have made it very clear. They made it clear in this special, or her son did. They are adamantly against WWE ever inducting Owen into the Hall of Fame. They want nothing to do with WWE. They don't want to do business at all with WWE. They don't want the company that they hold responsible for his death to have the satisfaction of putting him into their Hall of Fame or trying to make any money off it at all. Any money off it at all. Doesn't sit well with them. They're not going to stand for it. Look, I would love to see it in a perfect world. Hearing their perspective on why they don't want it, I get it. I totally understand. And I support them. I support their wishes as a fan. I'm not going to sit here and go, well, it's really unfair. No, you know what? They're right. They're right. Their wishes should be respected. Martha got a nice little burn in on him, too, in one of these interviews. I don't know if you saw her comments to CBS Sports. She said, their Hall of Fame, they don't even have a hallway of fame. It doesn't exist. There's nothing. It's a fake entity. There's nothing even tangible about it. It's just an event they have to make money. They put it on TV, they have a celebration, and it is just so ridiculous. I would never entertain it. It is garbage. Wow. They don't even have a hallway of fame. I love that line. That's such a great line. They don't even have a hallway of fame. She is actually not against the idea of Owen being honored in the Hall of Fame, just not the WWE Hall of Fame. Owen got inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame 2 years ago in Iowa with Booker T and Bruiser Brody and a few others, and she has the plaque. I have a picture of her. She's proudly displaying the plaque. She didn't attend. I don't think her kids attended the ceremony. The other members of the family did. Maybe that's why. Maybe she just didn't want to be around them. But she has possession of the award, and she proudly displays it. It's this nice plaque with like this kind of drawing or illustration of Owen's face on it. So she is not against the idea, as long as it is not Vince McMahon's Hall of Fame. She does not seem to have an issue with it. In fact, she was on Talk is Jericho, and she said that New Japan was always very good to them when Owen worked there. And Jericho, he saw an opening here. And Jericho brings up the idea. He goes, if you were to show up in New Japan to honor Owen's work there, I think the people there would love it. It would be such a nice thing. And she seemed receptive. She seemed open to the idea. So it sounds like Chris Jericho may have just gotten the wheels in motion for something in New Japan with Owen when all of this pandemic stuff is over. It sounds like she's open to that as a possibility. So that's why I kind of laugh, like all these people, oh, she hates wrestling. She has nothing to do with wrestling. Really? Well, her comments and her actions seem to suggest otherwise. That maybe it was never so much about wrestling, it was about Vince McMahon and the company and the way that they kind of handled the situation at the end of his life. Now, I also saw a lot of comments online after the episode aired from fans calling this woman every name under the sun. Calling her a bitch, calling her the C word. You people make me sick. Even if you believe that Martha does hate wrestling, oh, it's not fair, Owen should be honored. Here we are 21 years later. The man died 21 years ago this month. And yes, we are talking about it again now because of the television show, but people still talk about Owen Hart to this very day. It has been over 20 years since the man passed away. Owen Hart does not need the WWE Hall of Fame for any kind of validation. And to insult the widow and the family and the man's kids, oh, son, it's not fair. They're being selfish. They're being selfish. I saw that too. I couldn't believe it. I just shook my head and I laughed. I couldn't help but laugh when I hear shit like that. They're being selfish. To insult the widow because she's stopping you from seeing a WWE Hall of Fame induction? What the hell is wrong with you? What the hell is wrong with you? This is not your hill to die on. Learn to show some fucking empathy. Owen was a great wrestler. He made a lot of people laugh. His death was preventable. It never should have happened. And regardless of whether he gets his name added to a website, he will never be forgotten.